It was a picture of idyllic English life at first glance. Church Crookham, a small town nestled in Hampshire, where the loudest sounds were the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. But behind the neatly trimmed hedges and unassuming brick facades, a story was unfolding, a story that would soon shatter the tranquility of this quiet community. This isn't a story about violence or malice, but about a love that blurred the lines between domesticity and the wild. This is the story of Dan Brandon. Dan wasn't your average guy. He wasn't content with the ordinary, while others were pursuing typical careers and hobbies. Dan was building his own personal ecosystem, a haven for creatures most people only saw in zoos or on nature documentaries. He was a fitness enthusiast, yes, a strong and capable man, but his true passion lay in the world of animals. He wasn't afraid of the unconventional, the misunderstood, or even the dangerous. His home wasn't just a living space. It was a sanctuary for a diverse collection of exotic pets. From birds of prey to tarantulas, each creature held a special place in Dan's heart. But among this menagerie, one animal stood out, not just because of her size, but because of the unique bond she shared with Dan. Her name was Tiny Dot. Now, let's address the obvious irony. Tiny was anything but small. She was an 8-foot-long African rock python, a powerful constrictor capable of exerting immense pressure. These snakes are apex predators, designed to subdue and consume large prey in the wild. They aren't domesticated animals in the traditional sense. They're creatures of instinct, driven by primal urges. Yet, Dan saw something different in Tiny. He saw a creature capable of connection, of trust, of even affection. Don had raised Tiny since she was a hatchling. A tiny, harmless thing that could comfortably curl up in his hand. Over the years, he watched her grow, providing her with the care and attention she needed. He became intimately familiar with her habits, her moods, and her quirks. He believed he understood her, and perhaps, on some level, he did. He spent countless hours handling her, allowing her to slither across his arms and shoulders. He shared photos and videos of their interactions online, showcasing their unique bond to the world. Too many. These images were unsettling, even frightening. They saw a man willingly placing himself in harm's way, risking his life for the sake of an unusual pet. But Dan didn't see it that way. He saw it as an act of trust, a testament to the deep connection he shared with Tiny. He believed she would never intentionally hurt him. His mother, Barbara Brandon, would later testify to the extraordinary relationship between her son and his python. He loved all his animals, she said, but Tiny was special. She was his favorite. Those close to Dan echoed this sentiment. They described him as a responsible and experienced animal handler, someone who understood the risks involved in keeping exotic pets. His friend, Chris, once remarked, Dan never feared his animals. He respected them, especially Tiny. It was like he understood her. But even those who admired Dan's passion couldn't deny the inherent danger of keeping such a powerful creature in a domestic environment. And in the weeks leading up to the tragic events, there were warning signs, subtle shifts in Tiny's behavior. That should have raised alarm bells. She became more restless, more unpredictable, even showing signs of aggression. Dan himself noticed these changes. He quietly adjusted his handling routine, ceasing to allow her to wrap around his neck, a practice he had previously enjoyed. He was aware that something was different, that Tiny wasn't quite the same gentle giant he had come to know. But despite these concerns, he couldn't bring himself to part with her. Their bond was too strong, the connection to deep. The legalities surrounding the ownership of exotic animals in the UK are complex and, some would argue, inadequate. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976 allows individuals to keep potentially dangerous creatures, provided they obtain a license from their local authority and meet certain safety requirements. However, enforcement is often lax, inspections are infrequent, and the system relies heavily on self-reporting. This creates a situation where dangerous animals can be kept behind closed doors with minimal oversight. Dan's case highlights the inherent flaws in this system. He had obtained the necessary licenses and, by all accounts, took reasonable precautions to ensure the safety of his animals. But ultimately, regulations can only go so far. They can't account for the unpredictable nature of wild animals, the strength of their instincts, or the subtle shifts in their behavior that can signal impending danger. Sometimes, no matter how much experience you have, no matter how much you love an animal, the wild within can never truly be tamed. And when that wildness rears its head, the consequences can be devastating. In Dan's case, that devastation was just around the corner. It was the morning of August 25th, 2017. A day that began like any other in the quiet village of Church Crookham, except it wouldn't stay that way for long. Inside the Brandon household, Barbara began her usual routine. The kettle went on, toast popped in the toaster, the small domestic noises of a house slowly waking up. But something was off. An unsettling quiet permeated the air. Usually, by this time, she'd hear Dan moving around upstairs, the faint thrum of music, the soft hiss of the reptile enclosure heat lamps, a symphony of sounds unique to her son and his unusual menagerie. But this morning, silence. A thick, heavy silence that pressed down on her, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. She called out, her voice tentative at first. Dan, breakfast's almost ready. No response. A knot tightened in her stomach. She called again, louder. This time, a hint of urgency creeping into her tone. Dan, come on, you'll be late. Still nothing. The silence remained unbroken. A primal fear began to claw its way into her thoughts. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Reluctantly, she began to climb the stairs. Each creak of the wooden steps seemed deafening in the unnatural quiet. She reached his door. It was closed, as it often was, to help maintain the climate for his exotic pets. She told herself it was nothing. He was probably just sleeping in. But the nagging feeling persisted, a cold dread settling in her bones. She knocked, gently at first. Dan, a pause. Still no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. Dan opened the door. The silence held, mocking her growing panic. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed the door open, peering into the room. And what she saw in that moment would forever be etched into her memory. Dan was lying on the floor, sprawled near his bed, utterly still. The room was dim, lit only by the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. At first, she didn't understand. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping. But then she noticed the unnatural angle of his limbs, the stillness that went beyond rest, the unnatural pallor of his skin. He wasn't breathing. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her mind struggled to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be happening. Not to Dan, not to her son. And then she saw it. A movement. a slow, sinuous undulation across the floor. Tiny, the massive African rock python, out of her enclosure, moving almost languidly across the room, seemingly unconcerned. Barbara's mind raced. It couldn't be. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken enclosures. Dan looked untouched, but there was something undeniably wrong. The coldness of his skin, the unnatural stillness. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, stifling a scream. She needed help, now. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy and unresponsive. Her voice trembled as she dialed 999, struggling to explain the impossible to the emergency operator. "My son, he's not breathing. I don't know what happened. There's a snake." The paramedics arrived quickly, their sirens wailing. Through the quiet morning, they rushed into the room, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. Barbara stood back, numb, watching as they worked frantically, desperately trying to revive her son. But it was no use. After what felt like an eternity, they stopped. One of the paramedics turned to her, his face etched with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. There's nothing we can do." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her world collapsed around her. Her son was gone. Gone. And then, as the paramedics began their examination, the chilling details began to emerge. The subtle, almost imperceptible signs that told a horrifying story. Ruptured blood vessels in his eyes, subtle bruising around his neck and chest, so faint that they could easily have been missed. Internal injuries, signs of asphyxiation, signs of being, slowly, silently, squeezed to death. By what? By what? The answer was right there, in the room with them. Tiny, the snake he loved, the snake he trusted, the snake he allowed to roam free in his room. She'd been nearby, but not coiled or in a striking position. Almost as if the thought made her blood run cold, she was oblivious to the aftermath. A detached observer. There were no bite marks or claw marks. A snake doesn't have claws. There was no evidence of a savage attack, no frenzied struggle, just stillness. And the crushing realization that Dan had died in utter silence, alone in his room, betrayed by the very creature he had loved and protected. The eerie silence of that morning took on a new, sinister meaning. It wasn't the silence of sleep, but the silence of death, the silence of a life extinguished, the silence of a bond broken in the most horrific way imaginable. It was the silence that haunted Barbara's waking hours and filled her nightmares, the silence that would forever remind her of the unthinkable horror she discovered that morning. The morning Tiny took her son's life, and the morning hers ended as well. The inquest concluded. The coroner ruled, and the news spread like wildfire. Don Brandon's death was officially declared an asphyxiation caused directly by Tiny, his 8-foot African rock python. But that was far from the end of the story. In fact, it was the beginning of a national reckoning. A fierce debate that tore through communities and sparked uncomfortable questions about our relationship with the while the media latched on. Headlines screamed about killer pythons and exotic pet dangers, often sensationalizing the details and painting Dan as a reckless thrill seeker. But the truth, as always, was far more nuanced. It was a tragic confluence of love, trust, and the cold, uncaring logic of nature. Experts flooded news channels and online forums, offering their often conflicting opinions. Herpetologists spoke of constrictor behavior, explaining how even a playful squeeze could turn deadly without malice. They emphasized that snakes, regardless of their upbringing, are driven by instinct, not emotion. A python doesn't love its owner in the human sense. It associates them with food, warmth, and a safe environment. But that association doesn't erase millions of years of predatory programming. Think of it like this. One expert explained on a BBC News segment, a dog might accidentally bite you while playing fetch. The intent wasn't to harm, but the potential was always there. With a python, that potential is amplified exponentially. Other experts focused on the legal framework, or rather, the lack thereof. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976, a relic from a bygone era, came under intense scrutiny. Critics pointed out its vague wording, its reliance on self-reporting, and the inconsistent enforcement across different local authorities. It was a patchwork of regulations that left gaping holes, allowing individuals to keep incredibly powerful and dangerous animals with minimal oversight. The act is simply not fit for purpose in the 21st century, argued a representative from the Born Free Foundation. It's a bureaucratic nightmare that prioritizes the rights of exotic pet owners over public safety and animal welfare. The debate raged on, fueled by fear, misinformation, and genuine concern. Some called for a complete ban on owning large constrictors, arguing that the risks were simply too great. Others defended the rights of responsible reptile keepers, emphasizing the importance of education, proper enclosures, and strict safety protocols. But lost in the noise and the political maneuvering was the human element. The devastating loss suffered by the Brandon family. Barbara, Brandon, Dan's mother, found herself at the center of a media storm, forced to relive the nightmare of that August morning over and over again. Yet, despite the overwhelming grief, she remained remarkably composed, refusing to demonize Tiny and consistently emphasizing Dan's deep love and respect for animals. Dan wouldn't want Tiny to be punished, she said in a televised interview, her voice trembling with emotion. He understood the risks. He accepted them. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. Dan's memorial service was a somber affair, a testament to the impact he had on his community. Friends and family gathered to share stories, to remember his infectious laughter, his boundless enthusiasm, and his unwavering passion for the animal kingdom. Photos were displayed, capturing Dan's unique bond with his exotic pets. Dan feeding a hawk, Dan cradling a tarantula, and of course, Dan with Tiny, his beloved python wrapped around his shoulders. The images were both heartwarming and unsettling, a stark reminder of the blurred line between affection and danger. Dan's memorial became a focal point for grief, but also for reflection. His story served as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that even the most experienced and well-intentioned animal lovers can fall victim to the unpredictable nature of wild creatures. In the end, Tiny was rehomed to a specialist reptile facility, a decision that sparked further debate. Some argued she should have been euthanized, deemed too dangerous to be kept alive. Others believed she deserved a second chance, an opportunity to live out her life in a safe and secure environment. But the truth is, Tiny was just a snake, an animal acting on instinct. The real responsibility lay with the humans who brought her into their world, who blurred the lines between domestication and the wild, who ultimately failed to recognize the inherent risks involved. Don Brandon's legacy is a complex one, a tapestry woven with love, loss, and unanswered questions. He will be remembered as a passionate animal lover, a devoted friend, and a tragic victim of circumstances. His story serves as a stark reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature, and the importance of respecting the boundaries that separate us from the wild. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency, the flaws in our legal system, and the delicate balance between love and control. And ultimately, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes even the deepest affection isn't enough to overcome the raw, untamed force of instinct.